Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at day number 2, the final day of the FIDE World Blitz Chess Championship being held in New York City. Now, it's a very big day. We have an 8-player knockout featuring Magnus Carlsen, Hans Niemann, Wesley So, Jan Nepomniachtchi, Alireza Firouzja, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, Volodar Murzin, and maybe I'm forgetting one name, although I'm not 100% sure. So the massive epic final featuring 8 top players, we are going to finally have a winner crowned, and will it be Magnus Carlsen repeating, or will it be another player? So, we're going to pick it up with Magnus' first match playing against Hans Niemann, the future first American world champion. The first game was a very nervy game, ending in a draw, and in the second game in the best-of-4 match, Hans Niemann shocked the world by winning a beautiful game with the white pieces to take a 1.5 to half lead over Magnus. So Magnus in serious danger of being eliminated by Hans in the first round, the quarterfinals of this event, and let's pick it up in the third game. Magnus with the white pieces opens with d4, and now we get the move knight f6, and here we have bishop f4. Now this, of course, is the classic London system. It's something that Magnus has played with great effect over the years, and it's something that has become part of his main repertoire, especially as it relates to rapid and blitz chess. So after we get the move bishop to f4, we get d5, and now we have the move e3, bishop f5, and here we get the move c4, and now e6. Now, bishop f5 is considered to be one of the most solid replies against the London system. It's something that I actually played a lot during the heart of the pandemic, during the online events of 2021 and 2022 against strong players like Levon Aronian. So we get knight c3, knight bd7 played here, and now we have the move knight f3, and Hans goes bishop b4, developing the bishop from the f8 square. We get bishop e2, castles, castles, h6, and now we have the move queen b3 being played. Now what Magnus is aiming for here is to put pressure on the pawns on b7 and c7, maybe even some pressure in the center of the board as well with the weak pawn on d5. So now we get the move bishop takes knight. Magnus recaptures with the pawn. His idea here is later on he would love to trade on d5 and push c4. Hans plays b6, we get takes, takes, we have the move c4, and now the move bishop e6 is played. Now at this point, this opening has been a resounding success for Magnus, trailing in the match here. He's got the 2 b's here, and also very fluid and easy play in the center of the board. So we get rook a c1. Hans plays the move c5, we get rook f d1, and now we get the move queen e7. Now what Hans is aiming for in this position, or I said resounding success for Magnus or Hans, I forget which one. At this point, it looks like Magnus is doing quite well, but from Hans' standpoint with the black pieces here, he's looking to trade some pawns in the center, and if you can trade enough pawns here, you'll notice that the dark square B on this diagonal is actually staring at a bunch of empty squares. So we got pawn takes pawn, knight takes, we got queen to b2, and now we have the move rook f d8. Here Hans is developing the rook to guard the pawn on d5 with the knight, the bishop, and the rook. We get the move pawn takes pawn, knight takes, bishop to e5 is played, pressuring the pawn on g7, and now we get the move f6. Here Magnus plays bishop d4, we get rook a c8, and now we have the move h3 being played to create the classic lift for the king, avoiding any ice skater checkmates, but also potentially down the road, maybe you have knight h4 as well, and you stop bishop g4. So we get knight a4, queen a1, knight c5, and now Magnus plays move queen b1. Of course, trailing in the match here, Magnus cannot afford to make a draw, because if he draws this game, he'll be down 1 point and playing with the black pieces in the final game of the match. So we get knight to a4. Magnus now plays queen a1, knight c5, and here we get the move bishop c4. Magnus is trying to set up the classic double wooden shield here with both of these b's in the middle of the board here. And at the same time, you'll also notice there are some light square weaknesses around the black king to boot. We get the move bishop to f7, and Magnus plays a4, and here we get the move knight b4. Now this move is not necessarily a huge mistake, but after this move, it feels to me like Magnus's plans become a little bit too easy. He trades the bishop for the knight, and now we get rook takes, and we get the move pawn takes bishop. Very important to note here, by the way, that the time remains even between the players, but this is a spot where pawn takes is actually a slight mistake. I suspect what Hans thought he could do is just trade on c5, take with the queen, and he'd be fine. But after rook d8, king h7, there's a very unfortunate problem with queen to b1, checking the king and pressuring the knight on b4. And after knight c2, you get rook d2, queen g6, and now after a move like queen b3, this knight is very iffy here. It has no good squares available in this position. You're also threatening rook d8 to line up a back rank checkmate here with queen g8, a double stack on the 8th rank, and it's very hard to play. So we get the move pawn takes bishop. Magnus plays queen c3 here, guarding the bishop, and now we get the move knight a2. Now this is a move after which black is close to losing. It's a very difficult position to play anyway here, because if you trade the bishops and play queen to f7, for example, white can go queen to f4, or maybe even queen g4, lining up a bunch of threats like rook d7 with a kebab and a 90-degree right triangle, and it's very hard to play. Now keep in mind also, you don't want to spend too much time, because both sides here, whoever has the easier plan should be able to execute and really put massive pressure on the clock. So we got knight a2. Magnus plays queen d3, a very nice move here, as he now controls the only major open file with the queen and the rook on the d file. We get knight b4, and now Magnus plays move queen f5, pressuring the rook on c8. Now what you'll notice here in the last 3 to 4 moves, as we've gone from a situation where the time has been balanced to where Magnus is now up 30 seconds on the clock, and all of his ideas are very straightforward. He can try to trade the bishops. He can try to create the kebab with rook d7. He pressures the rook on c8, pressures the pawn on c5. With all of these ideas in play, Hans is going to have to defend, and as time gets lower and lower, it's much easier to attack than it is to defend. So here we get the move rook d8, and this is a move after which the game is effectively over. This blunders a pawn here. Hans probably thought reaching an endgame here, simplifying material, would give him chance to survive, but he needed to play rook c7 here, stopping rook d7 with the kebab, and after takes, king f7, knight h4, and the move king g8. White is much better here, but you're still hanging on for dear life after knight g6 and queen e8, because you can try to push p with c4, c3, and c2. Instead, we get rook d8. Now Magnus trades the towers, takes the pawn on c5, and at this point, white has an extra pawn here on the e file. Due to the weak knight being away from the center of the board, stuck on the queen side here, combined with the fact that you now have these light square weaknesses, the position is simply overwhelming for Magnus Carlsen. So we get bishop takes bishop, queen takes, king h7, we get the move queen f7, and now we have the move queen g8. Magnus is threatening both knight e6 and knight f5 to try and checkmate this black king on h7. So we get queen g8, queen e7, knight d5, Magnus plays queen c5, attacking the knight and the pawn, and now we get the move queen d8. Here we have knight to e6 being played, attacking the queen, we get queen to b8, and this move just hangs the horse on d5. Frankly, with 5 seconds, there's no way that Magnus doesn't win this. After queen to a8, for example, and e4 here, let's just say you go knight b4, now white can play queen c7, threatening the mate, and after queen to g8 here, white can simply take the juicer on a5, and after takes, white has 2 extra pawns here on the a file and e file, and the rest is basic technique. So Hans plays queen b8, hanging the horse. Magnus captures it. Now you see why h3 was so important, because after queen to b1 check and king to h2, white will win the game with the extra pony. So after queen takes d5 in this position, Magnus gets a very, very important win to tie the matchup at 1.5 against Hans. He would go on to win a very nervy 4th game as well to win the match by a final score of 2.5 to 1.5. Now in the next match, he would play Jan-Krzysztof Duda, and he would beat him in 3 consecutive games in the best of 4 match. This means that Magnus is now on a 5-game winning streak as he heads into the grand final against Jan Nepomniachtchi from Russia. Now in the first game of this match, Magnus with the black piece would win his 6th game in a row to take a 1-0 lead, and we're now going to pick it up in the second game of the best of 4 match in the grand final with Magnus up by 1 point. So the game starts out with e4. Jan plays move c5, and now we get c3 from Magnus. This is of course known as the c3 Sicilian or the Alpine Sicilian. We get the move d5, takes, and now white plays d4. Now you see the whole point behind c3. You're trying to build a bit of a white center with this chain of pawns. Nepo plays knight f6, we get knight f3, and now we have the move e6. Magnus plays bishop e2, and here we get knight c6, and now we have the move castles, takes, bishop e7, knight c3, and queen d6. Now this position, I've actually spoken about a little bit on my stream in the past. This is a position that I actually studied a whopping 25 years ago. Now, I don't remember the exact game that I played. I think it was against a kid from Portugal in the 1997 or 98 World Youth Chess Championship. But this was a line that I actually studied from the black side nearly 25 years ago. So to see this on the board today in this game, it kind of made me a little bit nostalgic because it's something that I looked at so many moons ago. At any rate, as the game continues, we get knight to b5, and now Jan plays queen d8. Here we get bishop f4, knight to d5, trying to stop white from forking. If you were to play a6, knight c7, it's uh-oh spaghetti-o time. The king and the rook get forked, and you are losing in a very big way. So we get knight d5, bishop g3 is played, and now we have the move castles, and here Magnus plays rook c1. Now we get bishop d7, and we have the move knight c3, and here Jan trades and plays the move queen a5. Now there is a very slight imbalance here in the center of the board. White can try to go c4 and d5. Black has these outside pawns potentially. If black could get the rook to c8, let me just set this up, something like this, for example, now there can potentially be a ton of pressure on these two pawns down the road, but you're going to have to be very, very fast in setting it up. So after queen to a5, in this position, now we get the move queen to b3 played by Magnus, guarding the pawn on a2, but also pressuring the pawn on b7. Here we get b6, and now Magnus plays rook fd1, and we get the move queen to a3, and Magnus plays queen b1. Now when Magnus goes queen b1, he's playing this move because he does not want to trade off the queens, but also because now with the queen on this diagonal, you can go bishop d3, target the juicer, or down the road, even something like knight g5, and there's a big checkmate threat towards the pawn on h7. So we get rook fd8. Magnus plays h4 here, creating the lift for the king, but also setting up the idea of playing knight to g5, where the pawn holds the knight, and you set up the checkmate threats towards this pawn next to the king. So we get rook c8. Magnus goes knight g5, and now Jan trades the bishop for the knight, and he plays the move knight e7. Now, at first glance, you're thinking, well, white has these double pawns here. These pawns in the center could be a little bit brittle. But the thing is, white has the two Bs once again. And as we know from Magnus Carlsen, one of the great hallmarks of Magnus's chess is knowing how to use the bishop pair. So we get the move c4 here, avoiding hanging this pawn on c3. It also cuts off this knight from going to d5 in this position. We get queen to a5, and now Magnus plays bishop f4, guarding this pawn from being captured. Here we get the move bishop a4, Magnus goes rook d3, and now we have the move queen f5 being played to potentially pin the rook on d3, but also pressure this bishop and the pawn. We get bishop to e3, and now Jan goes bishop c6 here, trying to line up some threats, maybe checkmate the king on g2 here, but also if white plays a3 after bishop e4, once again, it's uh-oh spaghetti-o time, as you're going to lose the rook or the queen on b1. So we get the move rook to a3 from Magnus. Great move here. He pressures the pawn on a7. And if black were to trade the queens, now you'll notice that both of these pawns are being attacked by the two towers. So we get bishop e4. Magnus plays queen to b2, and now we get the move rook d7 here. This move is designed to protect the pawn on a7, and now we get f3. You will notice here, of course, that rook d7 is a serious inaccuracy, but already it's very hard to play because if you were to play a5, for example, you hang this pawn, so both the pawns are under attack, and if you, the best move according to the computer is to go bishop a8, because now if white were to take, I think after knight g6, there's some tricks with knight h4 and queen e4 here, and maybe you can drum up some counterplay and save the game. Instead, we get rook d7, and now after f3, we get this move bishop takes f3 being played. The problem is when you move this bishop back to b7 or a8, it doesn't really matter which square, but let's just say a8. Now there's bishop to d3, the rook guards the bishop, and the queen is trapped. This bishop guards the pawn. Queen has no squares available. The queen is going to be captured anywhere it goes on the board. And for that reason, Jan just sacks the bishop here. He could have already resigned this game. He sacks the bishop. We get takes, knight g6, queen c2, knight h4, Magnus trades the queens, goes d5, we get takes, rook c5, and pawn takes, and after the move bishop to g4, Jan plays rook d2, we get bishop takes e6, and Magnus wins his 7th game in a row to take a 2-0 lead in the grand finals. So Magnus has been on a massive tear. He beats Hans 2 games to win the quarterfinal match. He wins 3 in a row to dominate Jan-Krzysztof Duda. And now he's won the first 2 games of the grand final against Jan Nepo. This is looking very similar to the recent Chess Champions Tour final that they played in Norway, where Magnus triumphed convincingly. So it's 7 in a row, Magnus is doing great, right? Well, in the next game, the 3rd game of the match, Jan Nepo would win on demand with the white pieces to get the match back to 2-1. And we're now going to take a look at the 4th and final game of the normal portion of this match. Magnus ahead by 2-1. He has the white pieces. All he needs to do is make a draw, and he will defend his World Blitz title. So we get the move e4. Jan plays e6 here, we get d4, d5, and Magnus once again plays knight c3. Now, it's very interesting to me that Magnus played this because in the Chess Champions Tour, when he was leading the match convincingly and he only needed a draw with white in that event, he played knight c3 as well. Now, to me, it's surprising because when your opponent plays the French, you can always play the exchange French, and generally this is considered to be very dry, very boring, and it's very, very hard to lose. But Magnus plays knight c3. It worked in that game of the Chess Champions Tour final, so why play around with anything if it's not broken? So we get knight f6, e5, knight d7, knight e2, c5, c3, and now Jan plays knight c6. We get the move a3, and at this point, we're still following that crushing game where Magnus defeated Jan last week in the Champions Chess Tour final. This also is the same line that, of course, D. Gukesh played against Ding Liren in the World Championship match. So we get a5 here, Magnus plays knight to f3, we get a4, and now we have this move h4 being played. After we get h4, we have knight b6 here. I believe in their game in Norway, I think queen to a5 was played. I don't know if it's this exact move or earlier, but this time Jan goes knight b6. Now we get knight to f4, and here we have the move knight a5. Now what Nepo is trying to do here is trying to take advantage of these weak light squares on white's queen side here. The pawn supports a knight jump. You can also jump to c4 with the other knight, and you're simply hoping to create counterplay. Magnus goes rook to b1. We get bishop d7, and now we have the move bishop d3. Magnus's idea is to simply castle the king to the king side and ignore whatever happens here on the queen side. Because if black were to go knight b3, white can simply play the move bishop to e3, and even though this knight looks really good on b3, you're overprotecting this pawn on d4 with the bishop, the knight, and the pawn, and there's simply nowhere else for this knight to go. So knight could be out to lunch. So we get the move h6. Magnus castles, we get queen c7, and here we have the move rook to e1 from Magnus. This idea, I think, is fairly prophylactic. I think he wants to stop black from ever playing f6, because then you would crash through on the e file, and so it's a move that tries to prevent f6. We get the move knight c4, Magnus plays knight h5, and here we get the move bishop b5. What Nepo is trying to do here is try to potentially trade off this dangerous bishop on d3 down the road by moving the knight away. We get pawn takes pawn here from Magnus, and this is a move that I understand, but it's actually a move after which Nepo should be very happy, because when he takes the pawn and we get knight d4, bishop d7, even though you can tell that white is better according to the computer evaluation, now the pawn on e5 is a weakness. You can't really open up the queen side easily, and in a must-win situation, especially with black, you don't care what the objective valuation is. You need some imbalance in the position. So we get the move queen g4. Jan castles the king, and now we get to move queen f4. If Magnus were to eat the juicer on g7 here, this is actually still good for white, but probably Magnus was worried about some tactic, like maybe a rook g8 idea, and after takes, something like knight b3 here, you have to contend with this pin on the g file here. Maybe the pawn at e5 can become weak, and in a situation where you only need a draw, this is not what you want to go for, because this is basically where you're either going to win the game or you are going to lose. There is literally no in between. So we get the move queen to f4 being played, and now Jan plays queen to e7. Here we get b3 from Magnus, takes, and after takes, Magnus has opened up the b file for the tower. This king is a little bit iffy. If you could magically put this queen on a7, for example, all of a sudden black's king is very close to getting checkmated. So we get bishop c6. Magnus plays bishop to e3 here. Now he's not worried about giving up the bishop because he wants to line up the double stack on the b file and massacre this black king. Now, what you also will notice about this position is look at white's king. This king is very, very safe on the king side. Both sides have castled to opposite sides, but you're thinking to yourself, well, in this position, where is black's attack? This knight on h5 stops anything major from happening. This is looking like a clean steamroll win for Magnus to finish the event. So we get the move g5 here. Magnus plays queen d4, shifting the queen and intending to go for queen a7 and attack on the b file. Nepo takes on h4, we get knight to f6, and now we have the move bishop g7. Now what has changed in terms of the valuation here is that the computer actually wanted to move queen to a7 right away to attack. Magnus, of course, not being a computer most of the time, probably thought that if he goes queen a7, there's simply no big threat here. Black can maybe play something like h3, maybe a d4, maybe a rook g8. It's very easy to see the boogeyman, and remember, Magnus does not need to win this game. He just needs to avoid a loss. So he goes knight f6, which also stops black from using the g file. We get bishop g7, and now we have the move rook b1. Here, Jan trades the bishop for the knight, goes queen c7, and now we get this move queen to a7. This move is a fairly serious mistake from Magnus, because what it does is it forces Jan into a situation, which I've mentioned many times, both in this video and in recent videos about Rapid and Blitz, where there is no plan for black except the move that he plays here. Now in this position, what Magnus should have played was bishop to f4, and after e5, you can go queen to a7 here, because now if black were to take the bishop, you go bishop f5, checking the king, and after rook to d7 is played, now you can take the rook. If black takes back, you simply check, you sack the rook, and all of a sudden you're losing both the queen and the rook in succession. So This is what Magnus should have played in the position. Instead, he goes queen a7 right away, and now Nepo finds the only move in the position, rook h g8. And what I mean by the reason that this move, queen a7, was so bad is that there are no other moves here. White is crashing through. There's queen a8, there's rook b7, there's bishop b6. Your king is under massive fire, and the only thing you can go for here is to use the open file for the rook. And now suddenly you'll notice it's actually very hard for White to play because there are big threats here. There's a threat of h3, there's a threat of d4, and all of a sudden, Black's rook on this open file gives him sufficient counterplay, and not only enough counterplay, but serious chances to win the game. Now, Magnus plays the move bishop to f4, and this is simply a clean blunder from Magnus. It's a move that I understand. He's getting low on the clock. He's getting attacked here on the king side. It's a move that looks decent, because you sack the bishop, but now you can sack the rook with rook takes pawn, and out of nowhere, you are going to ladder checkmate and become the World Blitz champion. The reason for that is if Black takes the rook, you take the bishop, queen and rook guard each other to checkmate the king. If Black plays, I don't know, knight to d2, for example, you go queen a8, setting up the ladder here, and after queen b8, queen takes, the rook and the queen checkmate the Black king once again. So it's simply GG, right? You've sacked the bishop, you sack the rook, you're checkmating the king, but here Black can do a counter sack. And Jan sees the move, rook takes g2 here. He sacks his own rook on g2, and Magnus has to take the rook. If you go king h1, there's queen to h2, which is simply checkmate. And if you go king f1 here, Black can take on f2, and after takes, bishop b7 here, Black simply is an extra knight on the board. You have a rook, bishop, knight versus a rook and a bishop. So Magnus takes the rook. But now Jan finds, again, the only move to win the game. Everything else would make Magnus the World Blitz champion, but he finds another sacrifice with knight to e3, and Magnus has to resign this game because if he takes with the queen, there's d4, which creates the fossil. Pawn attacks the queen, but now your bishop checks the king, and after you lose the queen here, let's just say king g1 and takes, this is GG, why not? Queen covers the b8 square. You're getting checkmated on the g file as well, and it is an epic disaster. If you play the move king g1, there's queen g4, checking the king, and then queen g2 mate. Same thing if you go to h3, exact same checkmate exists. So you can't move the king to g1 or h3. You can't take with the queen. If you go king h1, it's the same checkmate, queen f3 and queen g2. And last but not least, if you take with the pawn here, now Black has rook g8, checking the king. You go to h3, queen g3 is mate. You go to h1, there's check, and then queen g2 checkmate. So a huge victory for Jan with a double sack. He sacks the rook, sacks the knight, checkmates Magnus king, and in shocking fashion, he wins 2 games in a row to tie the match up at 2-2. So this means we go to overtime, or sudden death as we call it. Now in recent years, FIDE, the governing body in chess, they've moved away from the Armageddons, where you play one game where one side has to win or the other side wins. Now they've gone to a system where it is sudden death, so you play until someone wins. So that means that going into the situation, we now have the players basically on the same number of points at 2-2, and whoever wins the next game will become the World Blitz champion. Now, we're not going to actually look at any of those games because everybody would like to get my opinion, so I'm going to tell you exactly what occurred in the tiebreak games. So it's 2-2. Now, they would play 3 games of 3+2 Blitz. All 3 of these games would end in a draw, leaving the match deadlocked heading into the 8th game of the match. But in shocking fashion, after the 7th game was agreed to a draw, their 3rd draw in the sudden death portion, Magnus made an offer to Jan, which he simply could not refuse. Magnus made the offer suggesting that the players be crowned as co-World Blitz champions without someone winning the title outright. Now, first thing that I will say about this is it's shocking to see Magnus make this proposal because the rules very clearly state that you have to play until there is a winner. Those are the rules, and those are the rules that players have agreed to abide by from the start of the competition. Now, from Nepo's standpoint, it's very, very difficult because the moment that Magnus makes this proposal, for Nepo, he either has to be like, no, let's just play right away, or if there's any hesitation, then suddenly you don't know what's going on because Magnus could, of course, also be playing some mind games here since he's going to get white in the next tie-breaking game. So Nepo doesn't know what to do, which then means we have this big, long discussion taking something like 20 to 25 minutes where FIDE now has to come in and decide, is this allowed or is it not allowed? Now, ultimately, FIDE would decide to agree to Magnus' proposal. Jan would, of course, have to agree himself that it's okay that there are co-champions, but we end up in a very odd situation where the players are crowned as co-world champions of the event. FIDE effectively bows to Magnus' wishes, and this is where I'm going to give my hot takes. Now, this event has been held for the better part of a decade now in its current form, being called the World Blitz Championship, the World Rapid Championship. There have been plenty of tiebreakers in the past, and not once have we ever ended up in this situation. Now, when we talk about something like the genes, that's one thing, because ultimately it's a fairly minor issue. It's something that I would say does not have any impact on the event or the chess itself. We want to see the chess. We want the chess to decide who the winners are. And in this case, when Magnus makes this proposal and FIDE goes along with it, I simply don't know what to say. I'm left flabbergasted because when the players came into the event, the rules were very clear-cut about how the tiebreakers were. I myself have been in tiebreakers. I played against Magnus Carlsen in a tiebreaker in the 2019 World Blitz Championship as well, and there was no such proposal. So why now do we suddenly end up in the situation where it is okay, where Magnus can propose it and FIDE goes along with it, violating their own rules, which they have set out before the event? I simply don't have an answer to that. I mean, people will be surprised because usually I'm very positive about what Magnus does or says, and I think generally it's good for chess. But this is a situation where I cannot stand with what Magnus has done. I do not think there's any precedent for this when you put out rules about the game itself and then suddenly you decide it's okay, we're going to go home, especially when not that many games were played at the tiebreaker. It is unconscionable to me. I really cannot understand this. This feels like a situation of FIDE getting burned by what happened over the genes, and they suddenly go back on their very own rules. So we end up with a situation. It's not something I can really agree with. I don't think it's fine. It would be akin to, say, having a tennis match being played where, you know, it's something like 8-8 in the fifth set. You're like, nah, you know what? Let's go home. Let's not play anymore. Or to use another example, it's like playing in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals in hockey. You've played one overtime and you're tied after one overtime. And you're like, you know what? Let's not go out and play a second overtime. Let's not have a winner. Let's just decide we're both champions. That's simply not how things are done. And so for me, I really don't know what to say about it other than I'm absolutely shocked that FIDE did this, and I don't think it is right at all. And you know, we'll see what the outcry or what people say, but this is not something where I can support Magnus's point of view. I think it's completely unacceptable. You know, where you have a winner, you have a gold medalist, a silver medalist, a bronze medalist, and it makes me wonder why suddenly now it's okay versus the many times Magnus has played in tiebreakers, whether it's his match against me in the World Blitz in 2019, whether it's his match against Fabiano in the World Championship where they drew 12 classical games. Why now are they suddenly okay with changing the rules or bending them because Magnus wants them to be different? I don't know. And for me, I don't think it's okay. And I think it sets a very bad precedent. It's very dangerous. I think also because we know if any other player did this, it would not stand. The players would not be okay with it. That player who proposed it, they would be, I don't want to say they'd be fine, but the chess world would not be happy about it. So I myself am very unhappy about it. I don't think this should have been the case. I think there should have been a clear winner. But it is what it is. And unfortunately, it means that there's going to be a whole new round of drama surrounding the events of the World Blitz and Rapid here. Seems like every day there was some new drama, something happened. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. And I'm simply trying to keep you guys informed of what's going on. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the second day of the World Blitz Championship, the fifth day of the combined Rapid and Blitz event. With that, we wrap up the great year of 2024. So if you guys are not already subscribed to my channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below. And we'll be back with some more great recaps. Definitely some video content related to what happened with some reacts in the coming days and weeks. But that's going to do it for now. So I hope all of you guys, if it's already New Year's in 2025 in Europe and other parts of the world, hope you guys are celebrating in fashion. If you're here in America like I am, hope you guys are getting ready for a rockin' New Year's Eve. And I'll see all you guys on the other side as we take another trip around the sun in the great year of 2025. See you guys. Have a great rest of your evening. Bye.